Senator from Florida.
And I want to begin by thanking Senator Nelson, the senior senator from our state, for once again raising this on the floor, and I'm glad to be able to follow him. Just to make many of the same points about the importance of acting on this. The presiding officer is from a state that has been impacted by storms and knows that long after the cameras leave and long after the stories aren't being written, real people and real lives are disrupted, sometimes permanently, and certainly in ways that we don't come to think about. We come to think about hurricane damage as roofs being ripped off of buildings and trees in the roads. But once that's picked up, everything's back to normal. What we don't recognize is that underneath all of that is the long-term damage done to a small business that went 2 weeks without any sort of income, and so they closed. Is the impact we see in the Florida Keys, where we have a lot of people, for example, that use their retirement savings to buy a small property that they rent out in the Florida Keys. Very common. You buy a small townhouse, you rent it out in the winter to people that stay there, and then you use it in the summer for your family. Well, guess what? This winter, you're probably not getting a lot of visitors. In some cases, I know of one in particular, there's all this debris from the storm that's sitting in the canal. So it's not very attractive to a visitor to come to the Keys and stay in a townhouse where they can't even go out into the ocean because the canal, the waterway that takes them out, has a refrigerator floating in it, has all kinds of debris. By the way, there's still debris in there from previous storms, almost 15 years and 10 years ago. So what does that mean? That means that the owner of that unit, that rent that they were using to pay the mortgage, because he might be a teacher and she might be a firefighter, and now they don't have enough money. They're not getting that income they're counting on to make the mortgage, so now they fall behind potentially and could lose this rental property which they had invested in for their families. These aren't rich people. These are people that basically made an investment for the future and had a good business model until the storm came. And that's not measured anywhere, but that's real harm. And the small businesses, the Florida Keys in particular, is a place that has a lot of small businesses that have been there for a long time. And some of these places have gone months without clients, but if that person doesn't come and rent out that unit I just described, then that means that person isn't using fuel from the gas station there, that person isn't eating at the local restaurant, that person isn't contributing to the local economy. And to top it all off, it is so expensive. And the further south you go in the Keys, the more expensive it gets. Imagine if you're a worker at one of these buildings making $15 an hour. It's so expensive. They already had a housing problem, and this has only made it worse. So it would be a mistake to say that hurricane damage is over. The effort to address it ends the minute the trees are removed from the road and the roofs are tarped and repaired. It goes on for a while. And in the case of this particular storm, Florida was also impacted by the impact that Maria had on Puerto Rico. As Senator Nelson just outlined, upwards of 300,000 American citizens. I say that because there's still a lot of people that wonder, why are we giving foreign aid to Puerto Rico? And you have to remind them, Puerto Rico is a U.S. territory and its residents are U.S. citizens. 300,000 U.S. citizens from Puerto Rico have moved to Florida. And they enrich our state, but our schools weren't counting on the kids, and so they've got to scramble to deal with that. And our housing stock. You have people, I met with a group on Friday, you still have people living in hotels. They've been there for 3 or 4 months. And even if they wanted to go out and find an apartment, there's nothing available. And there's all sorts of challenges. We've heard stories, for example, about you have to pay a $75 application fee for each one of these housing units that you apply for, even if they turn you down. Well, if you apply, you can just figure that out. If you apply for 3 of them, 4 of them, that's a lot of money out of pocket for someone that's already lost everything in a storm. Florida's facing that as well. And so I am disappointed. If you had told me that we would have gotten to the last week of January and we still hadn't taken up disaster relief, I would have been surprised. And because we had a chance to actually address this at the end of last year. The House sent over a bill that didn't go far enough. The Senate had ideas about how to make it better. And then for reasons involving leverage and using it as a tool to get people to vote for CRs and short-term spending at the end, it's kind of been held up. And it's unfortunate, because these problems are only getting worse, not better, as time goes on. Senator Nelson talked about Florida agriculture, in particular Florida's citrus industry. One of our signature, if not our signature crop, was already being challenged by citrus greening, which is a terrible disease. Senator Nelson and I went to some of these groves together, and you have these growers that basically already were hurting. They lost everything for this year. So no money coming in. The fruit is gone. Once that fruit touches the ground and that ground is wet, you can't sell it. The trees are damaged. And it's not like you can just go buy a new tree at Walmart and in a year it's producing. These things, you got to put it in the ground. It takes 5 years before they start to produce. So they're already hurting and they're wondering to themselves, should I replant? Is this a good line of business for me to be in? Some of these families have been in citrus for 3 or 4 or 5 generations. And this could be the end. Not just the end for them, but the end of Florida citrus. We helped them in the tax bill with the ability to immediately expense replanting, but that won't be enough. And that's why this package has to include USDA resources to help replace these lost trees and to rehabilitate these groves that were flooded. And this is critical and essential to our food supply. The Army Corps of Engineers plays a huge role in the state of Florida. For example, the Herbert Hoover Dike, which is a dike that on Lake Okeechobee that prevents a catastrophic flooding event should the lake levels rise too high. You have people living just south of it. And it happened almost a century ago. People died because of flooding there. So this dike was built. It has been found to be and rated among the most vulnerable water infrastructure projects in the nation. And we are lucky that it wasn't breached in this storm, but it could have been had the rainfall been located at the right place at the right time. And it's been the priority of our delegation for a long time to expedite the construction of rehabilitation, to strengthen that dike. This is a good opportunity to do that because there will be other storms. Because the project was delayed when the storm hit, this is a chance to finish that role. Other parts that are critical to Florida's economy, beach renourishment, intercoastal navigation projects. These are hugely important, not just to what makes Florida an attractive place to live, it's the reason why people visit. Some of these beaches were severely eroded, particularly in Northeast Florida. There was no beach. The water's coming up to the edge of property lines. And if there's no beach, the hotels on that beach, the condominiums that rent out on that beach, there's no visitors. People aren't going there unless there's sand on the beach. And the erosion that happens in a storm like this needs to happen. And then, of course, we've all been engaged, and I hope all are committed, to our Everglades restoration projects. One of the most unique environments on the planet, happens to be in the United States and happens to be in our home state. And these Everglades restoration projects, we want to continue to make progress towards our goals of saving it. And by the way, the Everglades are a source of water for over 8 million Floridians. So I hope the disaster funding also has to address all the work that was destroyed and the damage that happened to a lot of the restoration projects that were in place. I won't go deep into education because Senator Nelson's already addressed that, but suffice it to say we have thousands of students that were displaced, and then you add to that thousands more from Puerto Rico that the school districts welcome but weren't counting on. And so now you've got to accommodate classroom space. In many cases, these children, although everybody in Puerto Rico learns English and Spanish, their primary language was Spanish, and so that means you've got to go and get instructors that are able to make sure we bring them to proficiency in English, and that it provides a challenge there. All of that is falling on the state of Florida as well. And while Florida welcomes our fellow Americans from Puerto Rico that are seeking refuge, the cost needs to be accounted for. We had hospitals that were damaged from the storms, and the repairs to some of these continue to rise. In some cases, these hospital repairs will result in the closure of a hospital for more than a year. There's a hospital in the Keys that's going to have to be completely rebuilt. And if you've ever been to the Florida Keys, the distances are vast. And there's a hospital that's going to have to be completely rebuilt. In addition to all that, we have our healthcare providers in Florida that provided charitable care, not just to Floridians after the storm, but to displaced Americans from Puerto Rico, from the U.S. Virgin Islands. They need to be reimbursed for doing that. They didn't sit back and say, we're not going to do it until you send us a check. They did it. But there was real expenses. They also got hit by the storm, and then they were dealing with those new expenses. And by the way, one of the things I hope we'll do is expedite hiring authority for medical personnel at HHS, because for years we have failed to maintain adequate levels of personnel willing to give a couple of weeks of their time to aid in time of a disaster. Our medical teams are depleted, and at this rate, we'll already have a staffing shortage by the next hurricane season, which is just a few months away. NOAA, another federal agency, the disaster funding bill needs to fund continued removal of the things I've already discussed: marine debris, lost lobster traps, capsized vessels from around the Florida Keys and our invaluable reefs. There's an environmental component to it, and there's an economic component to it. I am telling you, if you've ever been to the Florida Keys, if your canal is full of refrigerators, debris, things that need to be removed, you can't navigate in that water, you have wiped out the value of all that property, and you have wiped out the desire of people to come and visit. Beyond increasing, or as we call it around here, plussing up critical FEMA accounts like the Disaster Relief Fund, we should also include language to protect counties and cities and towns and individual homeowners who receive FEMA disaster assistance from the uncertainty about when the federal government may come back in a few years and claw back that support. In essence, come back in 3 years and say, we gave you too much money, give it back to us. Now, if someone did something wrong, I'm not talking about that. I'm talking about a good faith estimate that both sides agreed on, and they delivered the money, and then 4 years later they show up and say, hey, we looked at it again, and in hindsight, we gave you $1,000 more in the case of an individual, $50,000 more, $100,000 more in the case of a city or a county, and now they got to scramble to be able to pay this back. So I'm going to continue to work to make sure that FEMA has the resources it needs to assist recovery victims for both short-term and long-term recovery, but without this threat of clawback. And there are ways to do that that allow us to be fiscally responsible. And I already talked about the housing issue in Monroe County in Southwest Florida. Monroe County is the Florida Keys. And that's why it's critical that FEMA has the resources to utilize programs such as direct lease assistance, which enables the federal government to lease a property that would not generally be available to the public, such as corporate lodging, to house survivors, to house people, as opposed to just giving them a voucher and say, go find a hotel, because here's what happens. You get a hotel in South Dade, in Homestead, and the big race comes in February, and everybody gets kicked out because those rooms were booked a year ago for the race. And now you've got nowhere to go. It's disruptive. But if you were able to lease out an entire, long-term corporate housing or lodging facility, these people have some certainty to go about their lives while their homes and their lives are rebuilt. Programs like direct lease provide the type of flexibility that Florida, and quite frankly, the country needs. And we're going to continue to advocate for the program so we can provide roofs over the heads of displaced Floridians and Puerto Ricans. Infrastructure damage throughout Florida, also substantial. In particular, I was able to go down to the Everglades, to Flamingo. It's a place that we've gone often. It's one of the places we leave from to go fishing with my children. And the facilities there were already in bad shape, to be frank. Looked like something out of one of those 1960s black and white movies they show in schools. But this place was badly hurt. And again, an economic driver, but that's federal property. That is a national park that belongs to the American people under the custody of the federal government, and it was wiped out and hurt and destroyed, and we need to help rebuild those. By the way, that includes airports and NASA, the Kennedy Space Center, that suffered damages. A couple more points, and then I'll close. Housing and urban development. On the 14th of December, I introduced the Disaster Assistance Simplification Act. And what that does is it prohibits HUD from penalizing victims of natural disasters who apply but then turn down an SBA disaster loan. So you apply for an SBA disaster loan, and then you're prohibited, and then HUD will come back and take away your assistance or render you ineligible for HUD assistance, not because you received a HUD loan, because you applied for it. And that should be taken out. I've worked with colleagues to ensure that this language is included in the upcoming supplemental, because I just don't understand how we can allow an unsynchronized and burdensome disaster assistance program to make it more difficult for someone who's been impacted by a storm. You just went through a storm, your business was destroyed, your home was destroyed, your family had to move to another county, another city, and then on top of that, you have to agonize over what the federal government may or may not give you. And if they gave it to you, you have to agonize over when they may come back and take it away. We can't further victimize victims. By penalizing victims who do not take assistance, our laws are discouraging people from applying for SBA disaster loans. Because, again, on that particular point, I'm not talking about people that are double dipping. I'm talking about people that applied for HUD and applied for SBA. They didn't even take the SBA. Just the act of applying for that loan means you can't get the HUD assistance. That's ridiculous. I'll close on Puerto Rico because it doesn't get enough attention in my mind. The situation, we read about it every day, but now it's almost like the articles are like, can you believe that they still don't have electricity in Puerto Rico? There are a lot of problems that need to be addressed. Puerto Rico had a lot of problems before the storm. But at the end of the day, here's the bottom line. Puerto Rico is a U.S. territory. It is a responsibility of the United States. These are American citizens. Their children, their residents, wear the uniform of this country. If you go to Arlington Cemetery, not far from here, you will see their names after paying the ultimate sacrifice. They contribute in every area of our lives, whether they choose to live on the mainland or on the island. And perhaps because it isn't always in the headlines, a lot of people just don't understand its status, its importance, and our relationship and obligations. Now, we've been involved from the very beginning, not just because of the impact it's had on Florida, but because at a personal level, I have so many friends and people I care about who live there. And if you live in Florida, you know people who have people they love who live there. Right after the storm, I sent 3 members of my staff, spent over a week at their emergency operations center, just trying to act as a conduit to facilitate between federal efforts and the efforts of Puerto Rico's government. But their work remains as extraordinary. I talked about the people that are still displaced. We've seen the stories of people losing their housing vouchers and having the hotel people come in and say, well, we just heard from the government in Puerto Rico that your home is habitable, so you're done. Check out tomorrow at noon. They have nowhere to go. If they have family, maybe, but if they don't, where'd they go that night? It's a problem. We've seen that happen in Connecticut, and we fear it could happen in other places. On the disaster relief, we think that recovering is not just about putting up light posts. We think it's about helping the economy grow, about attracting business and investment back, and about helping people who want to stay to be able to stay. So we have a number of provisions that we hope will be included. One is a temporary payroll tax reduction, so that whatever it is you get paid, you get to keep more of it. Temporary for a year, but at least it's a way of giving people a raise without being a burden on businesses. We also would like to see a temporary expansion of the child tax credit. Because of a quirk in the law, people who file taxes from Puerto Rico are not eligible for it at its full value, the way someone on the mainland would be. And again, all they have to do is move to Florida, and they can do it. But these are U.S. citizens. If they can fight in our armed forces, if they pledge allegiance to our flag, if they are citizens of our nation, why should they not be entitled to the same tax provisions there that they would be if they were living on the mainland? We also need to deal with Senator Nelson talked about the Medicaid cliff. And that is because of the health care law that passed a number of years ago, the funding mechanism that was created places them in a position where soon they'll run out of money in their Medicaid program. And ultimately what will happen is people who need these services will move to Florida or some other state, and then they'll sign up for Medicaid in the state. And they'll get what they couldn't get in Puerto Rico, and it'll actually cost more. So if money is what you're worried about, it'll cost us more not to do it in the long run than to do it. I also think we need to increase funding for energy grid technical assistance from the Department of Energy. And on that note, I would say we are getting these reports that they are being forced to rebuild using the exact same equipment that was there before the storm. Some of this equipment is so old it isn't even manufactured anymore. They don't make it anymore. They've actually had to go out and retrofit and make stuff up. If we're going to rebuild or help rebuild the grid in Puerto Rico, shouldn't they just be able to put in the stuff that's modern as opposed to rebuild the old stuff? That makes no sense. It'll actually make the system more resilient. Now, a lot of these proposals may meet with resistance, but I'm telling you, they all make sense. We can justify every single one of them, and I hope that we will pursue them. I've worked very closely with the resident commissioner, Jennifer Gonzalez, on this effort, and I'm grateful for her strong advocacy and the support of so many of my colleagues on behalf of our fellow Americans in Puerto Rico. So I close by just asking our colleagues, I know we've got the policy stuff this week, the Democrats and Republicans are doing their thing. I know we've got a funding issue a week from this Friday that we've got to address. I know immigration is an important issue that we need to confront, but do not forget about disaster relief. We have to get it done for the people out west in California, for the people of Texas, for the people of Florida, and the people of Puerto Rico, for our fellow Americans that were hurt by the hurricane seasons and the fires of 2017. Mr. President, I yield the floor.